slop. I don't know how many outbound email messages you get in your inbox every day, but mine is overflowing, and they're highly personalized. They're great. They're just not relevant. And so I see a lot more of a shift back to physical environment, physical gifting. Dropping off or sending cupcakes to the office is actually working again.
Today, I'm very excited to be joined here by Scott Brown, the partner and head of platform at Cervin Ventures. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you on. Could you start by telling us a bit about your background and then tell us about what you do at Cervin Ventures?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. So I'm the head of platform at Cervin Ventures, which is a fancy way of saying I handle a lot of the post-transaction interactions with our portfolio companies, which is interesting given my background. So I'm 25 years as a B2B marketer in Silicon Valley, and I found my way into venture. Ultimately, now probably 50% of my job is focused on helping the portfolio companies grow their revenue motion and be more successful so that ultimately that they can become a great company of consequence. So Cervin Ventures, a lot of people haven't heard of us. We're an early stage B2B, so that's seed and Series A, primarily focused on enterprise application software here in the United States. Been around 15 years, about have 350 million in AUM, about 53 active portfolio companies. So I have a lot of balls to juggle at any one time. And we're just entering our sixth flagship fund that we'll be investing out of.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. You talked a little bit about the focus area, which is the B2B businesses, really on the enterprise platform side of things. So tell us a bit about the business's investment thesis when it comes to deciding which types of companies to invest in. I know you're more on the portfolio management side, but just to get a sense of what the main objectives that Cervin looks for when it invests.
Yeah, so especially early stage, a lot of what we're looking for is the founding team, the product IT idea, and the size of the market. Obviously, some of your later early stage, if you will, they might actually have a working product that we can diligence more or check with customers. But a lot of it is around the core team and the concept. And do we believe that this is the team that can grow it into a $100 million plus business? And so from Servin's kind of investment thesis perspective, we generally split our investments 50-50 between AI enabled or powered applications, and then more on the software around infrastructure staff, dev tools, cybersecurity, still software based, but things that are like more back office supporting than the application side. And of course, we can't have this conversation in the age of AI without talking about AI. So we have, primarily in our 15 years been focused on SaaS. A lot of that has moved more towards AI. And so we are very much focused on either vertical specific AI, so built for a particular industry or for a particular business function, like the CFO stack or some of the MarTech things. And we're looking for companies that are either AI native, so they're building from the ground up in this AI age, or that at least they have AI enabled their development and business processes. Because, if you're not using AI at this point, you're definitely going to be falling.
Yeah. A follow-up question to that, but on a similar line, obviously you're working with the businesses after they've been acquired. What are some of the traits, either in the business, the product, or the team, that you see that are the best indicators of success with the companies that you worked with?
Well, that's a tough question because there's multiple ways to measure success, especially at the early stages, right? Where you're doing that kind of test and iterate and trying to find the product market fit. So a lot of times I'm brought in to focus more on the go-to-market motion, so the sales and marketing side. And some of the traits that I'm really looking for are, how data-driven is the company? And are they building a firm foundation to be able to do things like test their ICP, build a sales pipeline that is both transparent and repeatable? And just like, how are they building the overall machine and building it for scale, right? A lot of times I run into in the early stage, people are like, oh, we're too early. We shouldn't invest in those systems. We don't have to do that thinking. We'll figure it out later. And constantly what I see is they'll get some success and then ultimately run into a brick wall because they didn't build that firmer foundation that can sustain them beyond that, say, first $1 million in founder-led sales. And so a lot of times I'm in there trying to remind them that they need to build the airplane as they're flying it and not just get so focused on flying it.
Understood. Obviously, when businesses are at that early stage, still trying to establish product market fit,
Mhm.
how much focus at that time should be on the sales side of things and trying to get that figured out versus building and the product? I know they kind of go hand in hand, but
Yeah.
what's your take on the best balance of the building versus the going to market testing and the sales side of things?
Yeah, I think I would differentiate like sales with a capital S versus sales with a small s, because I believe that the company, especially the founder, should always be selling and always be learning from that process and incorporating feedback and again informing the team and building. I think in the earlier days, it's the small s approach. It is primarily founder led sales. You don't need a lot of infrastructure and process to drive that initial traction, but you do need the mechanism to be able to capture that feedback and institutionalize it and share it across the team, right? So it can be in a CRM, but it could be literally a Google Doc that you just start writing like, here's who I think we're selling to. Here are the pain points I think we're solving for them. Here's what I've learned. And keeping like a running log, because that is invaluable to share with the product team, your eventual salespeople as they come on board, because they'll say, hey, have you tried X? Have you thought about Y? Have you sold to this customer? And without kind of having that institutional log memory, you're going to be, going over the same actions that you previously have. So the most difficult transition I see though is when you go from that smallest sales to largest sales, right? Because it really is a stepwise kind of shift in investment, in process, and effort by the team. And that's where I think a lot of companies run into kind of a stall. And so one of the things that as I'm working with our portfolio companies, I'm conscious of and working towards is making sure to like try to reduce the stress of that stepwise investment by chipping away at some of the foundational things that I know will lead ultimately to that success, right? Because if you put off everything until you need it, it's going to be a massive investment. It's going to slow you down. You're going to see a dip in revenue and everything else. So chip away at it over time.
I want to double click into this idea of transitioning from the small S to the big S. And I know we don't have enough time to cover all the nuances there, but when it comes to a business that's, I guess, established or just about to establish that product market fit, where now it's, going from the small S to the big S, they can really now systematize that and scale that up. What are some of the biggest challenges that businesses face at that point? And what do you typically see as the best ways to overcome that and actually graduate from the small to the big?
You're right. This would be a whole long conversation. This should probably happen over drinks. I think it's unique to every single company and every single situation. And some of it just comes down to how, I won't say easy it is, but easy for them to sell. Like, do they have an amazing product that sells itself, or are they really in a long cycle educational process with an enterprise buyer who requires all sorts of security? So it is very different for every situation. But I think the biggest thing is, again, a lot of the foundational. Like, do we have agreement not only on the ICP, but who's the buying committee that surrounds that? Who can block the deal? Because I like to say there's no one person who can say yes in enterprise software purchases, but there's 20 people who can say no, right? And so some of this is just building the education or awareness within your sales function of like the broader buying committee, what you're going to have to do to make these big sales. And so one of the issues that I see as people are transitioning from small S to big S is they become overly reliant on one lead channel or one motion or one buying committee kind of solve. And the market changes or a competitor comes on the market with a similar offering and suddenly everything falls apart, right? So especially as we see people getting ready to graduate to that big S, I'm constantly pushing them, okay, let's diversify the lead sources. Let's first of all make sure we're able to do attribution down to the deal level of like, where are these deals coming from? Who's working them? What are the touch points? But also starting to experiment and diversify that lead source stream.
Understood. So when companies are doing that, now they've established product market fit and they are trying to do that, what do you feel are the channels, especially when targeting enterprise buyers or more complex buyers? that are important to actually break through? Because if you can probably split it into a few different buckets, inbound, outbound, and that's really really simplified way of doing it. But even there's a lot of complexity now. And now that especially when go to market, there's a lot of tools and functionality that's now possible that maybe 5 years ago was much more difficult. So how do you bring in that sort of element into supporting these businesses, and what's now the most effective channels that you're finding?
Yeah. Again, I think what the effective channels are is dependent on the individual company and what they're selling, right? So it really starts with the customer, figuring out like where are they getting their information and how are they doing their process. One of the interesting things I've seen in the AI era is a lot, especially in the enterprise space, is a lot of the channels that for the last, call it 5 to 10 years, people have been discounting are suddenly back in vogue, especially because of GEO and AEO. So things like PR with mainstream media outlets, analyst relations with the Gartners, Forresters, IDCs of the world, physical events, because people are just getting overwhelmed with AI slop. I don't know how many outbound email messages you get in your inbox every day, but mine is overflowing, and they're highly personalized. They're great. They're just not relevant. And so I see a lot more of a shift back to physical environment, physical gifting, dropping off or sending cupcakes to the office is actually working again. And so I think for every one of my portfolio companies, we try to structure it so, okay, what's the core lead motion or lead channels? Like, where are we getting 70 to 80%, the bulk of our day to day leads? But then let's constantly experiment with some of these different channels and see how we can use that as an amplification channel.
I think Reddit is another interesting one that I've
Yes.
seen as a big emergence, especially when it comes to the AEO GEO topic. And so, is how much of a focus is these, non-typical channels, especially for the larger enterprise buys, which is have gone through a traditional motion before. How much is now that sort of thing becoming quite important in sort of go to market?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know that we know the answer yet. And so I've seen, this spectrum or the paradigm kind of shift multiple times in the last, say, year as everybody rushed to Reddit because it was driving AEO, GEO signal. And then, the various LLMs changed their model and Reddit may or may not be as important as it once was. And it really becomes this debate. And so the fundamental thing that I counsel our portfolio companies on is again, like, don't worry about the tactics, the edge case, the individual tools that are the latest, greatest things. Like figure out like what is it that your buyers, where are they shopping? What do they need to hear? And how do we reach them? Right. And so I saw overinvestment in tools in individual tactical efforts 12 months ago. People are really starting to pull that back because, yes, they've seen some results, but they're like, okay, we need to get back to the core. What is it that we're really trying to get this buyer to think, feel, or do? And what's the most effective channel for that? So Reddit, the metadata in YouTube videos, those are all important things, but I think ultimately you need a senior experienced marketer who's taking it up 2 or 3 levels and saying, great, if I'm trying to influence the CISO or the CIO, where do I need to deliver information? And what's the most credible channel? And, if you look at any of the enterprise buying surveys, ultimately in the top, call it 3 things that people listen to, it's what did their peers or analysts tell them, right? Because they want kind of that social validation that they're making the right decision. So ultimately, you've got to become embedded in that community and influence that community.
I want to talk now about the gap between what you describe businesses should be doing at that stage in terms of those channels and that focus versus what they're actually doing, and why there is that gap. What do you see as the biggest challenges for why businesses that have just graduated to the big S in terms of sales, what are the challenges they have in actually figuring out and approaching go to market in the right way?
I feel like I'm a broken record on this point, but it's a variety of things. And I think one of the things, again, in the early stage that I see is you have a leadership team or a founder who has heard the market story that, oh, somebody has built $100 million business with zero marketing resources. And we generally know that's not true. That's more of a narrative, but a lot of people are being told by their VCs or their boards, like, I have a company who did X and has an, completely agentified go to market motion and has no sales and marketing. There may be those cases out there, but those are always the overly optimistic view that the board is pushing down to a founder who then tries to get their team to implement. And so I think, one clear cut issue is when the management team believes the hype. And don't get me wrong, AI and agents and everything else add tremendous value, but it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of thinking, it takes good, clean data, and it takes people who know what, like they have the taste to understand what it is the agents should be producing. So I think one fail right off the bat is management committees or management teams kind of unrealistic expectations. The second thing is, I think people underestimate how difficult this go to market motion is. And I won't say that it's expensive, but it just takes time. Like thinking through the logic, thinking through the buying committee. Why do people make the decisions they do? And plotting all that out is a very intensive thought process and not something you can outsource to AI. Right. And so are people willing to invest the time and sweat equity to really think through all of this?
I want to pivot back to an earlier point, not about go to market, but you mentioned a lot of your investments in SaaS AI businesses. I was speaking to another VC partner actually last week or early this week, and they mentioned that, in their portfolio companies, a lot of them have had to rebuild their entire tech stack 3-4 times in the last year. Because there's this whole notion now, to what extent it's true is a different question. SaaS is dead. Now it's about agentic AI. And so a lot of
Mhm.
companies are almost having to rebuild what they're doing. I'm curious, to what extent is that the case with some of the businesses that you're working with and seeing?
Well, I think it's really interesting. We ran a survey across our 53 companies to ask them just like where they were deploying AI most broadly. And an overwhelming majority of them have deployed it in the product. And a lot fewer of the portfolio have extended it into things like marketing, sales, and especially back office. The adoption is very low. So everybody's using AI on the product side. The question is, how are they applying it or how are they using it? And one of the interesting things that we found is, especially if you're a company that's been founded in the last 3 years, you are using and thinking about engineering product build in a way than if you're older than this, right? It's almost the AI enabled versus AI native mindset. And what I will say is, and I'm already seeing this decrease, is that people initially thought, oh my gosh, with Claude Code or Codex, I can go vibe code all of these apps and I don't need to buy a SaaS, right? And while that may be true, I also say, like, this is maybe a bad analogy, but like if you want to ship a package and you're only ever going to ship one package, great, go build the truck to carry that one package. But if you're not in the business of shipping packages, just call it FedEx and put your 1,000 packages on there and let them take it. Right. And so I need to work on that analogy, but it's essentially like,
I think so.
if you're a
I think
startup,
so.
why build your own CRM? Like you can do it. Like why build your own ABM engine? You can do it, but why don't you outsource that? It's the classic build by partner kind of discussion that now that the initial interest or the wow factor of, oh, I can build these things with AI, it's now getting back to a question of, well, should I really be doing, or should I focus on my core business and outsource this functionality to somebody else who that's their core business? They're going to build the best CRM, the best ABM, the best ERP system. And I'm just going to make it easier potentially through AI and MCPs and everything else. Like I can connect the data and use the data better, but I don't actually need to build the core systems of action or record.
Yeah. You mentioned just there that the businesses are using AI a lot in the building of the product, which makes sense, less so in the other functions. So back to the go-to-market side of things, where do you think the opportunity is to use and leverage AI in the sales and marketing side of things? Because so far the discussion has been a lot on the strategy and the core side of things, which is crucial.
Yeah.
But now on that AI front, where do you think that opportunity really is?
Well, I think there's the near term opportunity, which is what I think a lot of people are activating, which is around content generation, content review, brand voice, and just generation of assets, images, campaigns, landing sites, things like that. Ultimately, though, I'm seeing a little bit of a slowdown on the productivity on the marketing and sales side, mostly because there are so many different marketing systems. If you look at like the MarTech stack that is published every year and it's got 10,000 vendors on it or whatever. The issue is tying all these systems together and tying especially the data architectures together, because everybody calls an opportunity something different or a lead something different. And so just stitching together all these different systems that people have bought is just taking a lot more time. So I think it's a lot of focus on the data. And as people are doing that, then it's unlocking huge opportunities, right? And in some ways, I think that that's the interesting next story is when we have a little bit more of a robust view on whole data, what can people do?
Scott, this has been a really interesting discussion on the tactical side of things or the AI side of things, but also the strategic side of things. So, my final question is if there are founders listening to this or those in the early stage, based on what you've seen and what you've seen works, what should be a key focus or what some of the learnings that someone who's trying to build a business or a team that's trying to build a business, especially on the go to market side of things, what would be your final advice for them?
Yeah, I think stripping away everything else that we've talked about, especially at the early stage, I think the biggest thing to focus on is the team. And do you have alignment both in terms of culture and priorities across the team? Right? Because especially when you're that small, you can't have the left hand and the right hand doing completely different things or not knowing what each other are working on. So the bigger focus is making sure those institutional learnings are distributed across the org, that everyone feels like they're on the same page and marching towards the same goal. And I think something that is both easy and hard for founders to remember is they've got to set that vision, right? Because there's going to be a lot of twists and turns on that growth path. But ultimately, they need to set a vision that's maybe 5 to 10 years out to say, here's ultimately where we're going. We don't exactly know the path that will take us there, but it's always going to be in this general direction. And this is what we're all driving towards so that like the entire team both knows what to build towards and what to prioritize, but also recognizes like when something doesn't work, it doesn't mean it was a bad thing. It's just a lesson learned.
Yeah, great. Scott, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Likewise, Aman.